Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 473. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to get through on today's show. I've been doing a lot of writing at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. And so this show should be a pretty good one, I think. A lot of important news, especially on the war in Ukraine. I'd really appreciate a share, a like, or whatever you could give me. If you're a regular listener, make sure you're subscribed somewhere. The show's at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version. The show, of course, is hosted with the Institute, so you can always find it on the homepage there. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And then, of course, social media is a great place to follow me because not only do I post every show, I also post all the articles I write, and I make the posts in all text forms. And I think it gets quite a good boost in the algorithm that way without posting a link. So on Twitter, it's at @KyleAnzalone_. On Instagram, it's KyleAnzalone3. And on Facebook, it's just Kyle Anzalone. Go ahead and send me a friend request and I will add you. And you can see all my content that way. And again, if you could, put it out there to some more people and help me spread the word. With that, let's get into the news today. The first story is a follow-up from something we talked about last week, and this is this story about Elon Musk and SpaceX and Starlink that has been widely misreported. So, Senator Jack Reed is leading an aggressive probe into Elon Musk and SpaceX's role in the American war industry. The investigation stems from an incident where SpaceX declined a request from the Ukrainian government to extend the range of Starlink for an attack on Russia. The incident has been widely misreported as Musk ordering SpaceX to deactivate Starlink in order to thwart an Ukrainian attack on the Russian naval fleet. On Thursday, Senator Reed said his committee, which is the Senate Armed Forces Committee, had launched an aggressive probe of Musk. The committee is aggressively probing this issue from every angle, he said. Neither Elon Musk nor any private citizen can have the last word when it comes to U.S. national security. The investigation stems from a portion of a biography about Elon Musk written by Walter Isaacson. Initially, Isaacson reported that in September of 22, Musk directed SpaceX to deactivate Starlink communications near the Crimean Peninsula to stop a Ukrainian attack on the Russian naval fleet that was underway. However, the author has since admitted that his original account of the incident was, as he said, mischaracterized. Musk had declined to extend Starlink's range to Crimea after Kiev made an emergency request. Isaacson said the decision was consistent with previous messages SpaceX delivered to Ukraine about the range of Starlink. Starlink, of course, is a product that's offered by SpaceX that allows users to connect through the internet by connecting to satellites in low orbit. The system was designed to provide internet for civilian uses, and Musk, has said that this is for Netflix and chill, this is for people working from home, this is for people, trying to do homework, from home, not from meant to be used in the military. However, SpaceX does allow Kiev to use the system for communications within the Ukrainian military. After the Russian invasion of Kiev, Musk provided Starlink to the Ukrainians free of charge. And this is another important point to maybe elaborate on here. The period, September 22, is when Ukraine is providing Starlink directly to Kiev free of charge. And so this isn't a case where, he has sold this product to the U.S. government. He's just given it to Kiev for their government. And, that's included the military. So still, the media and politicians have used this incident to attack Musk. A letter issued by Senators Jeanne Shaheen, Elizabeth Warren, and Tammy Duckworth suggests Musk deactivated Starlink at the behest of the Kremlin. And this is a direct quote from a letter that these senators issued. It is absolutely unreal. According to public reports, Mr. Isaacson claims that Mr. Musk, after conversations with Russian officials, interfered with the operations of Starlink services because his concerns about the impact of the Ukrainian military's operational decision-making as Ukraine has been defending itself from an illegal and unprovoked Russian invasion. And so if you read that, it sounds like it wasn't the Ukrainians who contacted SpaceX and made an emergency request to extend Starlink. It sounds like the Russians contacted SpaceX and made an emergency request to deactivate Starlink. And so they've completely flipped the story here. And this is really important because it completely changes what happens and why the decisions that were made. So while Isaac and Musk held conversations with Russian officials, there is no evidence that from his account that SpaceX's decision was due to the Kremlin's urging. And there's, no evidence at all that the calls that Musk had with the Russian officials were even anywhere near this particular incident and timing. So SpaceX's terms of service explain that due to U.S. law, Starlink cannot be used to carry out military attacks. Additionally, Musk said that his concern that Russia would escalate to nuclear war, not that he didn't want Russian ships destroyed. And so he's not saying that, look, I don't want, Ukraine to be able to take out these Russian ships. I'm obviously aiding Ukraine's war effort in allowing their military to communicate, which is probably one of the essential services that, made sure that Ukraine's military didn't collapse in the early days of this war. And yet, this is all being completely turned on its head. So, I read the terms of service the last time I discussed this on the show, so I don't want to go through all of it again, but, it does say Starlink is not designed or intended for use in offensive or defensive weaponry or other comparable end uses. Custom modifications of Starlink kit or services for end military uses or military users may transform the items into products controlled under U.S. export control laws, specifically the Export Administration's regulating authorizations from the U.S. government. And so this is important that if you have a company, let's say you're selling drones, right? And you sell drones to the Ukrainian government so they could survey damage to buildings, right? And they say this helps them find, people. But then you find out that they're taking your drones, they're putting bombs on them, and then, they're using those to carry out attacks. Well, then you would need express, permission from the U.S. government to continue to export them because they're being used as weapons. And so this is what Musk says. Additionally, Musk says he would have granted the request to extend the range of Starlink had it been made by the White House. So he's saying if this was done in a way that complied with U.S. law, he would have done it, which, from my perspective, isn't necessarily a good thing because, I don't want this to escalate to a nuclear war. And I'm not, there's a lot of questions, right? Like, had the range of this submarine been extended, maybe Russian systems would have thwarted the attack. That is possible. Yeah, everybody pretends like this is a sure thing that was sunk the entire Russian naval fleet. It may have hit one tugboat. It may have done some damage to the port, but not major damage to any ships. Again, it may have been thwarted and none of this would have come of it anyways. But if the narrative put forward that this would have been a major blow to the Russian naval fleet, then maybe Putin would just carry down a major escalation. Maybe it wouldn't have been nuclear weapons. Maybe it just would have been a massive bombing campaign in Kiev, an attempt to completely destroy the Ukrainian state. Take out all the Ukrainian state officials and military command and stuff like that. And so, I don't want a major escalation to the war. I want to see this thing de-escalate. I want to see talks between Kiev and Moscow, not the opposite way. So, but, again, from what the senators are saying, essentially accusing Musk of potentially being involved in treason, he is literally just complying with the laws that they wrote. So this is all really frustrating. And again, it just shows the level of hysteria, I think, around the whole Ukraine war in the U.S. right now, where you have this story that was misreported, and now they're taking to task one of Ukraine's largest private military supporters throughout the conflict. I mean, this is it's really absurd. So just wrapping up here, all four senators have suggested reviewing SpaceX's contract with the government as a result of the incident. Reid said the committee would look at broader satellite market government contracting and the outsized role Mr. Musk and his company have taken here. Senators Duckworth, Shaheen, and Warren suggest that SpaceX holding defense contracts pose a threat to national security. It poses a great threat to national security risks if DoD contractors are able to independently abrogate their provision of services. We are deeply concerned with the ability and willingness of SpaceX to interrupt their services at Mr. Musk's whims for the purposes of handcuffing a sovereign country's self-defense, effectively defending Russian interests. I mean, this is just so beyond the reality of what actually happened in that situation. And these are prominent senators, especially Warren and Duckworth are some of the more well-known members of the Senate, and that they're this wrong about this issue is extremely disturbing. And look, I don't care really if they take away all of SpaceX's business. I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk. I don't think he's the free speech advocate he claims to be. Throughout the Ukraine war, there's been a couple times where he has said things that are at least more reasonable than what typically comes out of the American political establishment. But overall, I don't think he's a particular ally of ours in the anti-war movement, the free speech movement in any way. If you look at what our friend Misty Winston often says, when was the last time that this man tweeted about Julian Assange? Very telling how much he actually cares about free speech, and saying that he would have allowed this to go through had the request been made by the White House. He really doesn't care about ending the war either. He's just complying with the U.S. law, but that the hysteria around the war in Ukraine is so severe that they're willing to attack an ally of theirs and claim he's guilty of treason for merely following U.S. law. It is very concerning about the level of hysteria we face right now. All right, next up here is an article I wrote for antiwar.com on September 17th. Milley and Stoltenberg say Ukraine's goals would lead to a long war. The top-ranking American military official and the civilian head of the North Atlantic Alliance believe the war in Ukraine will continue for years if Kiev is to achieve its war goals. Ukrainian President Zelensky has signed a decree outlawing talks with Russia and plans to restore Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. In an interview published on Sunday by the German outlet Funk Media Group, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the alliance must prepare for a long war. Most wars last longer than expected when they first begin. Therefore, we must prepare ourselves for a long war in Ukraine. We continue to recognize that if Zelensky and the Ukrainians stop fighting, their country will no longer exist. If President Putin and Russia stop fighting, we will have peace. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, spoke with CNN about his outlook on the war. He said there was well over 200,000 Russian troops in Russian-occupied Ukraine. This offensive, although significant, has operational and tactical objectives that are limited in the sense that they do not, even if they are fully achieved, they don't completely kick all the Russians, which is the broader strategic objective that President Zelensky had. That's going to take a long time to do that. That's going to be very significant effort over a considerable amount of time. I can tell you that it'll take a considerable length of time to militarily eject all 200,000 or plus Russian troops out of Russian-occupied Ukraine. That is a very high bar. It's going to take a long time to do it. And so I think he makes it very clear through those statements that he believes this is going to be a long war. The assessment comes as Kiev's war machine has stalled. Last year, Ukraine's military was able to recapture a significant portion of the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. However, Kiev's summer offensive has failed to meet its objectives, and Ukraine has sustained substantial losses of troops and equipment. The primary goal of the of the offensive was to recapture Mariupol and sever the Russian territory in southern Ukraine. So far, Ukrainian forces have only advanced a few kilometers in that direction. Milley recently predicted Kiev would only have about a month before weather conditions would cause the offensive to end. Zelensky's overall goal is far more ambitious: to retake Crimea, the Donbass, and southern Ukraine. Kiev has said it's not willing to compromise on the issue, and the Ukrainian president has issued a decree preventing talks with Russia so long as Vladimir Putin remains president. It is unclear how long Kiev and its Western backers can continue to fight a war of attrition against Ukraine. American defense officials have warned that arms transfers to Ukraine have depleted U.S. arms stockpiles. And I actually had a little bit of a conversation with Daniel McAdams, the director of the Ron Paul Institute, about this on Twitter last night. And, there are a couple things that could cause this war to end from the Ukrainian side. Of course, there's, a collapse of the Ukrainian government, either in the civilian sense or in the military sense. The army falls apart, the civilian government kind of ceases to exist, and then the rest of the state crumbles. So either those things could happen. The Ukrainians could run out of troops. The West could run out of arms to send Ukraine. Or it could be that, there's a significant change of heart in Moscow or Kiev even. And the other possibility, of course, would be the American people saying, absolutely not, we're tired of this, we're not sending any more of our weapons. I think that maybe is the least likely. Maybe the most likely ways that this war ends is Ukraine loses the war of attrition. More likely, I think on the arms side, they just the West runs out of weapons to send Ukraine. So I point out in this article that one concern is lack of artillery for Kiev. In July, President Joe Biden decided to send cluster bombs to Ukraine because America had reached its minimum stockpile of 155 millimeter shells. The transfer of cluster bombs likely violates U.S. law, as the bomblets spread by the munitions are notorious for killing civilians decade after war's end. Currently, U.S. arms manufacturers produce around 28,155 millimeter shells each month, well below the number used by Ukrainian forces, while the Pentagon Deputy Chief for Acquisitions, Bill LaPlante, said U.S. weapons firms hope to turn out over 1 million rounds per year by 2025. That will still fall short of Russia's current output, an estimated 2 million shells annually. The U.S. has pledged over $43 billion in military aid to Ukraine, including over 1.5 million 105 millimeter rounds. Still, Ukrainian officials say Kiev requires significantly more aid to be able to achieve its war goals. On Sunday, the head of Ukraine's Security Council published an op-ed outlining what Kiev would need to win the war. I am deeply convinced that there is only one effective solution to this problem: deoccupation of Ukrainian lands by military means. Russia and its ruling clique don't understand other language than the language of force and weapons. Therefore, the peace formula is the weapons formula. The sooner Ukraine receives enough modern weapons, the sooner it will be able to return to peace, which will be safer for Europe and the world. The practice of dosing military assistance to Ukraine out of fear of irritating Putin and provoking Russia to further escalation is fundamentally flawed. Refusing or delaying the transfer of modern weapons to Ukraine's armed forces is a direct encouragement to the Kremlin to continue the war, not the other way around. So that's I thought a pretty important quote that Ukraine put forward on what they're looking for. And we have Zelensky is expected to travel to Washington later this week to lobby Congress to approve $24 billion package for Kiev that was proposed by the White House. It's likely the Ukrainian leader will also meet with President Joe Biden. The war has the potential to spiral into a conflict between nuclear powers. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the U.S. is already at war with Russia. On Sunday at the Eastern Economic Forum. The Russian diplomat explained Moscow's position. No matter what it says, the U.S. controls the war. It supplies the weapons, munitions, intelligence, information, data from satellites. It is pursuing war against us. The stalled Ukrainian counteroffensive has led Kiev to step up its attacks inside Russia. Over the weekend, Ukraine launched a series of drone strikes on Moscow and Crimea. The Kremlin slammed Kiev for launching what it dubbed terrorist attacks. Moscow claims its air defenses thwarted the attack. Kiev's strikes on Russia are likely to increase as Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave Kiev a green light last week. When Washington's top diplomat was asked if he approved of Ukraine using American weapons to hit targets deep inside Russia territory, he responded by stating, in terms of their targeting decisions, it's their decisions, not ours. So he's, saying that Kiev could decide to attack whoever they want. All right, so next up here, we have a Czech general basically saying the same kind of thing that Stoltenberg and Milley just said. So the leader of the Czech armed forces told Reuters that the current offensive was going as expected, and he believed the war in Ukraine would stretch well into the future. This is the quote: "This is how a military offensive looks. It's not like a World War II movie. It takes time. In the overall picture, I think there is currently no capacity on either side to reach their ultimate declared objectives anytime soon. It won't last a few weeks. It will last for long, probably. And it's important that we keep supporting Ukraine for a long time." And so, we've even recently had American military officials say that the F-16s really are not going to be effective until 4 or 5 years down the line. And so, they're talking about 2027 when the F-16s will become effective for Ukraine. And if they're talking about waging war for that long, that's 4 years from now. What are the chances that we avoid, escalating to a serious direct war with Russia that eventually spirals into a nuclear conflict before them? All right, up here is another article I have for antiwar.com. Russia, the U.S. is at war against us. And I already talked about this quote in the previous Long War article, but I think it's really important to note here that, Lavrov really took aim at the U.S. for the $100 billion in military aid the U.S. and its allies have transferred to Ukraine since the start of the war. And I also note in this article that the White House is again considering sending ATACMS. These are the longer range missiles fired from the HIMARS. They have a range of about 200 miles to Ukraine. And this is interesting because Lavrov said that, this wouldn't be a major change to the war. He said, I am unable to comment on their statements. He's, referring to the potential, the Wall Street Journal report that the White House is considering sending the ATACMS to Ukraine. He continues here, but the fact is it will not change the essence of what going on in Ukraine is obvious. So I guess he's saying that Russia is committed to their kind of military aims that they're currently under. And I guess in some sense, this does make sense as, the UK has previously sent Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine. And so these have a range of 250, 300 miles. So I guess, the ATACMS may not be a significant step up from already what's going on there. Now, in separate comments made on Friday, Lavrov said that Washington's effort extends beyond a proxy war in Ukraine to a global campaign to isolate Russia. He explained that the West attempted to use a recent peace summit held in Saudi Arabia to turn countries against Russia. This is what Lavrov said. There is a real plot around the topic of the so-called peace negotiations, as well as attempts to turn everything upside down through pseudo-diplomacy. The West has been saying for months that this peace formula is the only basis for negotiations. It starts with innocent topics and then it comes to the purpose for which it was concocted, inflicting the strategic defeat on Russia to restore the borders of Ukraine as they were in 1991, court-martialed the Russian leadership, forced Russia to pay reparations, and then mercifully agreed to sign a peace agreement. These are the exact dirty methods that the West uses not only in relation to Ukraine, but many other areas of global politics. And so he's referring to the summit that the West held last month in Jeddah, where the Russian officials weren't invited to what they dubbed a peace summit. And what they did was they just got all these other countries that may have a more independent view on the war in Ukraine together. And then they allowed Zelensky to push the Ukrainian idea for peace and to kind of say that this has to be the basis for any agreement. And, as Lavrov pointed out, this means, retaking the Crimean Peninsula, retaking the Donbass, which is never going to happen. It means war crimes tribunals for the Russian leadership, which is never going to happen. It means that, Russia is going to be forced to pay billions, if not $1 trillion to Ukraine, never going to happen. And so it's not really the basis for any deal that would seriously end the war. All right. So in relation to, trying to isolate Russia and the idea of fighting this long war of attrition, we have, Russia developing interesting relationships across the globe. And we have here this article I wrote for antiwar.com on the 17th. Kim concludes visit to Russia with goal of increased across the board relations. So North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un concluded his 6-day visit to Russia on Sunday. While Kim did not ink an official agreement with Russian President Putin, the two leaders discussed several domains where the two nations plan to increase cooperation. The growing ties between Moscow and Pyongyang come as President Joe Biden has pledged to isolate Russia from the rest of the world. The Russian Minister of Natural Resources and Environment wrote on Telegram, the official visit of Comrade Kim Jong-un to Russia is over. We discussed issues of cooperation between the regions. Those are mainly issues related to the development of agriculture, the development of transportation infrastructure, transportation services, of course, cultural exchanges, education, and medical issues. Kim's time in Russia was his longest trip to a foreign country since ascending to supreme leader in 2011. Putin met with Kim shortly after he arrived in eastern Russia. The North Korean leader visited a Russian spaceport. Putin confirmed that the leaders discussed sharing technology in that domain. Russian military officials additionally hosted Kim at a base where the North Korean supreme leader sat in an advanced warplane. Top Russian and North Korean defense officials called for the two nations to strengthen military ties. TASS, Russian state media, reported. North Korea Defense Minister Kang Sung-nam said that the Korean People's Army is ready to strengthen combat brotherhood with the Russian armed forces and join forces to defend peace and stability in the region and on the planet. Pyongyang and Moscow have been tight-lipped on many details of what was discussed between North Korean and Russian officials. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov explained, as neighbors, our countries implement cooperation in sensitive areas that should not become the subject of public discourse and announcement, but this is quite natural for neighboring states. Before the summit, the White House speculated that North Korea would agree to aid the Russian war in Ukraine by providing artillery rounds to Moscow. Analysts believe that North Korea has massive stockpiles of artillery rounds and production capability. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller slammed Pyongyang and threatened additional sanctions on North Korea. However, as North Korea is already one of the most isolated nations in the world, it is unclear how much further Washington can expand the economic war against Pyongyang. Particularly if the U.S. is also trying to isolate Russia and China, two massive states that border North Korea. if we issue more sanctions against North Korea, but the Russians increase trade with North Korea, then North Korea is going to become actually less isolated, not more. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, downplayed the impact of any military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. When asked about the North Korean weapons transfers to Russia on Saturday, he said, "Would it be a huge difference? I'm skeptical of that. I doubt it would be decisive." After the Putin-Kim meeting, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol blasted the two leaders in a letter to the UN. Military cooperation between North Korea and Russia is illegal and unjust, as it contravenes UN Security Council resolutions and various other international sanctions. The international community will unite more tightly in a response to such a move. Yoon's attacks on Kim and Putin come as military ties between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan continue to grow. At a recent summit President Joe Biden hosted at Camp David, the three nations agreed to increase trilateral military exercises. Kim has accused Washington of attempting to form a new NATO-style alliance in the Pacific. The increased military ties with Japan have additionally irked Russia and China, as both nations have territorial disputes with Tokyo. In response, the Russian defense minister proposed trilateral military drills between Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing during the July meeting with Kim. The Kremlin is expected to send a delegation to Pyongyang in November to continue to develop the relation between the two nations. All right, next up here, an article by Dave DeCamp from last week. Ukrainian pilots complete orientation training on Swedish Gripen jets. Sweden said Thursday that Ukrainian pilots have completed their first round of training on Swedish-made Gripen jets. The orientation has been completed, and according to the report I received from Defense Forces, the training went well, the Swedish defense minister told AFP. Ukraine has been seeking Gripen jets throughout the war. The Swedish media reported this week that Stockholm was considering obliging the request, but the final decision has not been made. Although you would assume that with them agreeing to train the Ukrainian pilots on the platform, that they do plan to transfer them. Johnson said the preliminary training included test flights in both the aircraft and simulators and information sessions for the ground crew. He said the purpose of the training was to form the basis of the ongoing work to determine if Sweden can arm Ukraine with Gripens. So far, the only Western-made fighter jets pledged to Ukraine are the U.S.-made F-16s, which are more expensive to operate and hard to maintain than the Gripens. A major difference between the two jets is that the Gripen has never seen combat due to Sweden's long-standing policy of neutrality, which has changed since the country joined NATO last year. Or since the country applied to join NATO last year. They are not officially a member yet. Not sure how effective these planes would be on the battlefield, but I know that, I guess, particularly as, the West looks to give Ukraine longer range weapons and run short on artillery, air to surface missiles may be, a type of munition that the West has a lot of to give to Ukraine. And so maybe that's why, they're looking at getting them the Gripens as well as the F-16s. So another article here by Dave, and this was really interesting. Zelensky implies Ukrainian refugees in Europe will resort to terrorism if West curtails aid. So Ukrainian President Zelensky implied in an interview with The Economist that Ukrainian refugees in Europe might resort to terrorism if Western aid to Ukraine is curtailed. The Economist report reads, "Curtailing aid to Ukraine will only prolong the war," Mr. Zelensky argues, "and it would create risks for the West in its own backyard. There is no way of predicting how the millions of Ukrainian refugees in European countries will react to their country being abandoned. Ukrainians have generally, quote, behaved well and, quote, are very grateful to those who have sheltered them. They will not forget that generosity, but it would not be a," and this is, I guess, Zelensky said, "good story for Europe if it were to drive these people into a corner." Zelensky also said in the interview that was published on September 10th that anyone who is not supporting Ukraine is supporting Russia. If you are not with Ukraine, you are with Russia. And if you are not with Russia, you are with Ukraine. And if partners do not help us, it means they will help Russia to win. That is it. So this seems like a pretty bold threat for Zelensky to make. I wonder if, particularly as some countries in Europe, Italy, comes to mind as one, Poland is another, have been unwilling to take on refugees. If this kind of rhetoric may push these countries to be less willing to accept Ukrainian refugees. Now, I guess that also could work out well for Zelensky, because I believe Ukraine and Kiev are now kind of in desperate for more soldiers. And so, they're looking to bring back some of the refugees and conscript them into the army. All right, next up here is an article by Connor Freeman. He wrote this for the Institute last week. U.S. sanctions target Russia's ability to acquire Western tech for military purposes. The U.S. State Department and Treasury announced on Thursday a large sanctions package targeting Moscow's trade with some of Washington's allies and partners. The aim of this new sanctions package, one of the largest yet, is to block Russia's access to money, financial channels, and Western technology, allegedly being used to bolster Kiev's war effort. Among those targeted are 150 businesses and individuals from Russia to Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Georgia. Also in the crosshairs are the Russian energy sector, including Arctic liquefied natural gas projects, mining, as well as factories repairing and manufacturing Moscow's arms. Washington penalized a recently established company in the UAE, for instance, which is also said to be providing technology for engineering Russia's Arctic LNG-2 project. Russian Industry and Trade Minister Denis Mantov has said that the bilateral trade between the Russia and UAE grew to $9 billion last year, an increase of almost 70% in 2022. James O'Brien, the head of the State Department Office of Sanctions and Coordination, told the Associated Press that Foggy Bottom's goal is to restrict Russia's defense capacity and liquid it has to pay for its war. The trade with the UAE is particularly interesting because at the end of the Trump administration, of course, the UAE entered into the Abraham Accords, and this was really supposed to bring, the UAE into the Washington fold. And since that time, the UAE has not completely entered into the Abraham's Accords. It shied away from some of the arms it was given access to in those accords, and has maintained strong ties with Beijing and Moscow, even as Washington has launched an economic war on both of those countries. Back to Connor's article here, though. Earlier this week, however, the New York Times reported that since Russia launched its invasion, and despite the Washington-led sanctions blitz, Moscow has doubled its production of ammo and other armaments, including artillery, shells, and tanks. NATO said the collective West ammunition production capacity for Kiev is dwarfed by Russia, which is 7 times greater, according to an official with the Estonian Defense Ministry. Nevertheless, O'Brien boasted that Washington's economic war is succeeding. He insists that the way to measure success is on the battlefield, but Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive has utterly failed and netted only major losses of troops and equipment, with no significant gains, as Western military officials assessed would be the case before the offensive began. Several of Washington's partners and allies were implicated in these latest sanctions. Companies based in NATO member states Finland and Turkey were hit with sanctions because they are accused of facilitating Moscow's sourcing of European and American electronic components, including computer chips and processors. A Finland-based network was sanctioned by the Treasury Department for allegedly sending a variety of electronics to Russia, such as cameras for drones and lithium batteries. The State Department targeted Turkish firms said to be providing ship repair services to a company connected with the Russian Defense Ministry. Per the State Department, since Moscow invaded Ukraine last February, Washington has sanctioned nearly 3,000 businesses and individuals. Sanctions on Russia's energy exports had thus far failed to achieve their stated aims. Since last year, Russia has become the top supplier of crude to both China and India, the world's third largest and third largest oil importer. So China's 1, India is 3. And just to add to that, even the Western price cap on Russian oil, Russia is now trading oil on an average of $14 above the price cap, and there's really no discount on Russian oil on the market now. It's only about $5 per barrel that you're saving by buying Russian crude, by buying crude from a non-sanctioned country. And so it really goes to show how ineffective these Western sanctions have and economic war has become. All right, one last article here. And I know we usually say Middle East news for the Friday show with Connor Freeman, but I think by Friday we may know more information on this story. So I felt like I should probably just cover this one at the end of the show today. I wrote this for antiwar.com, September 17th. U.S. European partners sanction Iran amid prisoner swap negotiations. The U.S. issued dozens of sanctions on Iran as Washington and Tehran negotiated a deal that could see several prisoners released. Additionally, France, Germany, and the U.K. extended sanctions on Iran that were set to expire. On Friday, the State Department announced dozens of sanctions targeting Iran, 25 Iranian individuals, 3 media outlets, and 1 internet research firm were added to Washington's blacklist. The U.S. said the sanctions were in response to the suppression of protesters after the death of an Iranian woman last year. She was, this happened 1 year ago. She was kind of famously detained for not following Iranian's dress code requiring, women to wear a headscarf, cover their hair. She died from abuse while in police custody. And after her death, widespread protests against Iran's strict laws broke out. The new round of sanctions comes in anticipation of protests marking a year since her death. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the United States will continue to support the Iranians and all the people who are defending their human rights and fundamental freedoms. And today we will join people from across the globe in honoring her memory and those who were killed. Muhammad Sahimi, he's the NIOC chair in petroleum engineering at USC and commentator on Iranian politics, explained in Responsible Statecraft that sanctions will hinder more liberal policies taking hold in Tehran. He says the Iranian people living in Iran are fully capable of resisting the brutal and reactionary policies of the clerics, pushing them back for meaningful, irreversible reforms and putting their country on the path towards a democratic state. They do not need exiled fake opposition and American and Israeli patrons who, from their comfort of their homes in the West, call for street demonstrations, economic sanctions, and war. And so, Sahimi is just arguing there that the Iranian people, through their own organic protest, are able to liberalize their own country, where Western sanctions actually get in the way and hinder this. Additionally, the sanctions could interfere with ongoing talks between Washington and Tehran aimed at releasing prisoners. The prisoner swap could occur as early as this week and would see 10 people freed. The deal would also be a rare diplomatic success for the Joe Biden administration, which has taken an adversarial approach to nearly all states deemed potential rivals by Washington. There are other potential issues that could scuttle the agreement between the U.S. and Iran. The International Atomic Inspection Agency, the IAEA, UK, France, and Germany have all attacked Iran for following the 2015 nuclear agreement or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That's the JCPOA. The deal that was inked during the Obama presidency gave Iran sanctions relief in exchange for Iran limiting its civilian nuclear capabilities. Iran has a nuclear energy program that's obviously allowed. There's all these fake accusations that Iran is attempting to build a nuclear bomb. No evidence that Iran was ever attempting to build a nuclear weapon. This has been admitted by even the U.S. intelligence community, which, not to believe the U.S. intelligence community and what they say. However, since the main accusations of Iran attempting to build a nuclear bomb originate in Washington or Tel Aviv, the fact that the American intelligence community doesn't agree with that is, I think, very important and notable. And so Iran agreed to additional inspections and safeguards over its energy program in order to alleviate concerns that it would ever build a nuclear bomb in order to receive sanctions release. But in 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement, even as the IAEA, which is the UN's atomic watchdog, certified that Iran was within full compliance of the JCPOA. Trump went on to reimpose sanctions on Iran that were lifted per the 2015 deal and applied new restrictions on trading with Tehran aimed at crippling the Islamic Republic's economy. In response, Tehran began enriching uranium to higher levels and ended some additional inspections of its nuclear program that were required under the broken agreement. The JCPOA explicitly allows for Iran to walk back the limitations and inspections of its nuclear program if the other parties to the agreement break its commitment to lift sanctions. And so the JCPOA did explicitly say that if the U.S. reimposed sanctions, Iran didn't have to agree to the additional limitations on its nuclear program, because why would Iran follow an agreement that the other parties of the agreement aren't following? So this all made sense. But on Saturday, the IAEA head, Rafael Grossi, slammed Tehran for restricting inspections. I strongly condemn the disappropriate and unprecedented unilateral measure which affects the normal planning and conduct of agency verification activities in Iran and openly contradicts the cooperation that should exist between the agency and Iran. However, again, this was all taken in response to Western sanctions. Additionally, London, Paris, and Berlin announced the extension of sanctions on Tehran that were sent to be lifted per the nuclear agreement. In direct response to Iran's consistent and severe noncompliance within its JCPOA commitments since 2019, the governments of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom intend to maintain nuclear proliferation-related measures on Iran, as well as arms and missiles embargoes, after the JCPOA transition day on October 18th, 2023. And so you have these countries who their own ally Washington is the one who is responsible for destroying this deal, and yet they're still blaming Iran for it. It's just completely ridiculous. But this is the way the U.S. led world empire works. All right, that's all I have for today. I will make sure I talk about, I got like probably 5 stories on China that I've had for about 3 shows now that I definitely need to talk about. So I'll definitely have that on that show. Just been doing a ton of writing with antiwar.com, so I always have a lot to cover. Please, if you see my work anywhere on the internet, just give it a like, a share, whatever you could do. Help give it a boost in the algorithm so we can get out there to more people. Thank you all so much.